I should begin.
No, I've got it.
Okay. Let's begin. Thank you so much for coming to join us at this panel on conversations with data that I'm delighted to be moderating. Simon temporarily disappeared. He's back. So we have an hour and 15 minutes, and we're going to be discussing the theme of conversations with data, which is quite an open-ended topic. We're kind of going to be thinking about the extent to which working with data is like a conversation, how data can be used as a source in journalism along other sorts of techniques and practices such as the interview and sort of analysis of content and sort of documents. And I'm delighted to have with me today Gregor, who's at Datawrapper, Sam, who's at Global Witness, Lam, who's at Buzzfeed News, Caelainn, who's at The Guardian, and Simon, who's at Google. And what I'm going to ask them all to do, just very briefly to kick us off, is talk about their own experiences in working with data and then move into a kind of conversational format for the rest of the time that we have. So maybe we can start with Gregor and go along. Thank you.
Hi. Before I was working at Datawrapper, I was working as a graphics editor at the New York Times for about 4 years. At the Times, there's no differentiation between journalists and graphics people or interactive people, so we were all considered journalists. But I was not a journalist in the classical sense that my major source would be interviews or phone calls. But I was mostly dealing with data sets. So that was my day-to-day job, finding interesting data sets relevant to news events, seeing if there's something interesting in there. And yeah, that's how, should we keep it brief, the introduction? Yeah, okay.
So hi there, my name's Sam. I'm a data journalist at Global Witness. A bit different to some of the other organisations represented here in that we're primarily an advocacy organisation, so we campaign against corruption and conflict in the natural resources industry, so the oil, gas and mining industries. And in part because new transparency legislation has been introduced in various countries where we work, there's a lot more data on what companies are doing when they sort of pay for or pay royalties for mining or oil, gas and mining licenses, and this is the kind of data that we tend to work with. This is our sort of bread and butter for developing stories. And the types of questions that we ask of data, we do this kind of more traditional analysis where we look at, say, a particular oil contract and work out whether or not it's a good deal for people, and so that involves like projecting revenues and working out what the revenues from taxation will be and so forth. We do a lot of investigative work, and that involves kind of more like interrogating, I suppose, data sets and asking what are the discrepancies between what this company says they've paid and what the government has received. So comparing it to government receipts, for instance, and often probing data sets to understand what's been published but might not have intended to have been revealed. And there's some good cases where we found recently where, you know, a piece of transparency legislation has come in, a data set's been published, and it reveals far more about the company's activities than was initially intended. So that's the kind of shape of work that I do.
Hi, I'm Lam. I'm a data reporter at Buzzfeed News, specializing in social media data, which means I look at the worst parts of the internet every single day. But before that, I was with NPR and with the Wall Street Journal and Al Jazeera, always doing human stories. In large part, I was a video producer, and I think that really informed how I see data. My objective is always to see the micro and the macro understanding of a story, to understand the larger context through data, and to find the person who is emblematic of my data story. In recent years, I've become more and more interested in what is actually not measured in data. I think data is a value judgment made by people who collect it, and if you don't collect it, you don't care to track it. One of the best examples for that for me is the census in the US, which at the beginning in 1790 measured 3 different ethnic minorities, which were free white people, free other people and slaves. And now we have come, since the 1960s when the Civil Rights Act was implemented, we have now started collecting, I think, up to 20, maybe even more different race and ethnicity categories to hold the government accountable. And so for me, one of the biggest things nowadays is not just to look and have conversations and query data that's existing, but to create new data, to be able to look at stories that have been underreported for many, many years.
So my name is Caelainn Barr, and I am the editor of the data projects team at The Guardian in London. My background is journalism, initially. I came to data reporting through investigative work, where data journalism was giving me an opportunity to find stories that nobody else in my newsroom was finding. So that was my way in. And then from that, I built on Excel, kind of building up more technical skills, more programming-based skills, and I now work primarily in R. But the work that we do in the newsroom in The Guardian is very much focused with reporters. We kind of live and die by collaboration and by how well we work together with other teams in the newsroom. And I would say that about 80% of our job is finding the correct data, finding the correct sources, cleaning it, analyzing it, and then we get to the part where we're talking about the storytelling. So there's an awful lot of pre-processing before we get to the real kind of journalistic process itself. And our team very much works between the journalists and the graphics team as well. So we have kind of two outputs. So we'll kind of go through a little bit more of some of the projects that we've worked on, maybe I feel like some of the projects we've done recently are the best examples of how we've worked collaboratively and how that kind of informs the storytelling and enriches it as well.
Hi, so my name is Simon, and I work on the Google News Lab as data editor. A while ago, I suppose my data journey started when I was at The Guardian. I was a news editor, and I was working with the graphics team and collecting lots of data sets, basically, because the first time you look for carbon emissions data, it's kind of painful, so you keep it, and you end up with this kind of collection of data. So we started this thing called the data blog really as a way to publish that data and make it more useful for people to use. The idea being that we would publish data sets that were given to us as PDFs, we would publish them as openly as we could, and then give them out to the world, and the world would do magnificent things with them, because at that time we believed that by opening up everything, everybody's going to be lovely online, which obviously is not necessarily the case now, as we know. But it was a great experience in this kind of idea of conversing with people through data, and you'd meet people online who would know incredible things about the data that you were working with for a day. They'd known for 10 years, and they would know it really well, and that's an amazingly kind of humbling experience. I suppose now the difference is at Google, instead of working with quantitative data, I work with qualitative data that's in quantitative quantities, if that makes sense. So billions of searches every day. We which is an incredible kind of resource, can tell you what people really are interested in, really care about, and takes you kind of beyond the echo chamber of social media into this whole world of the way that people interact with each other every single day.
So it's funny, I think the last time I was in this room was also with Simon, and that was several years ago. I can't remember if it was before or after we did the first edition of the Data Journalism Handbook. So all of the people sitting on the panel are contributing to the new version of the handbook. And one of the themes that I think we've noticed, which has been a really interesting development in the field, is the way in which data has become an issue, maybe more than it was several years ago. So maybe before it was kind of treated as a source. There's ways in which people would use data and kind of think about how it could be used to tell stories and visualize and so on. Whereas I feel like now, both in relation to the kind of so-called sort of post-truth moment on the one hand, with kind of facts being problematized and challenged in all sorts of interesting ways, along with the rise of social media data and platform data, which people acknowledge, as Lam, I'm sure, can go into in more depth, is not just a straightforward representation of collective life or the social world. I know that all of you in different ways have responded creatively to this, whether it's through making new data or repurposing existing data in order to answer different sorts of questions or visualizing it in creative ways. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the sorts of strategies and practices which you have used in your own work to get a data set to answer different sorts of questions or to make data as a way of working with it. I know, for example,
You want to go first? Okay.
Somebody
Okay. So we just go around. All right. Less confusion. I think it would be too short to start with a data set, because there was always this talk about finding your story in the data, and I never found this to be the case in my day-to-day work. There's like always something happening. We're journalists, so there's something happening, and we're looking for additional information on a subject. There might be a shooting or something happens, and then you find out if you can find data to put it in a larger context. And so the first step in this is always finding the data before you can start talking to it. And I think that's one of the crucial moments already where I noticed that there's some kind of there's always stories that lend themselves easily to data journalism, where you have vast amounts of data, sports, politics, and then there's other stories that you end up with literally nothing. And I think that's another interesting part of this whole thing, like the whole story about gun violence, and there's like no database on gun sales in the US, or there's no database on deadly use of police force, and and so that's
So yeah, I mean, when it came on this panel, sort of thinking about the prompt being the idea of having a conversation with the data, you know, the first thing, obviously, you know, as Gregor sort of alluded to, is that you need to do is go and get the data. But even when you get the data, rendering it useful or rendering your ability to extract information from it is the first step, because, you know, you can have a silent data set that, you know, I remember fairly recently receiving very large PDF, 300 pages of bank transactions from a national oil company, and that wasn't going to tell you anything informative. So the first step being, of course, you know, finding the right setting and format and tool and software for you to be able to interrogate that data set. But then again, I guess there are further modes that I'm often pushed towards sometimes as one of the few people in my organization who can use data, which sometimes aren't like conversations and aren't particularly helpful. So, you know, some of those modes are, for instance, just ordering the data set about, because you have a very clear and robust strategy, what you want, and you kind of massage it into the form that you want it. But often that can end up with you kind of cherry-picking your results and not sufficiently listening to the context of that data set in order to be able to present your kind of findings fairly. The other side, and this is probably the thing that as we do a lot of investigative work, fall most victim to, is when you actually, it's kind of the pub situation and you've got a drunk friend with you and they're just chewing your ear off. And, you know, the data set is kind of loudly talking to you, and you come in with no preconceptions, no hypothesis, and you get lost in the data. You know, it becomes a rabbit warren that you're trying to follow lots of holes down, and you end up in a series of dead ends. And that can be particularly a problem with like very large data sets. So I think a conversation can happen at the point at which kind of you come in with a hypothesis, but you're sufficiently flexible to be able to kind of reevaluate that hypothesis should you learn something new in the course of that conversation. And also forming a common language. And I think it was interesting, Caelainn saying one of the big challenges being a data journalist whose primary job is actually to bridge the gap between other journalists, the graphics team, and make that a fruitful conversation, is doing that in a language which doesn't mean, hey, you're the data guy, go away and do your magic and bring back some stuff later. It's actually forming a common language that many people can converse with, and as you ask those first descriptive or exploratory questions, you can bring people in, even if they don't know how to write the code or anything like that. And I think that's where I found literate programming, where you can effectively write code alongside plain English, very, very helpful, because then a conversation of question and answer starts to emerge.
I'm going to put my professor hat on. I'm an instructor. I like to categorize things for myself. So when it comes to creative data practices, one thing that has happened in recent years that I really love is that people go beyond what is given to them. We are used to getting, let's say, a census table that gives us the entire population of the United States or the state of New York. But nowadays, we want to find our own ways of understanding and interpreting that data. The first way that that is done is by through FOIA requests oftentimes, but basically by requesting the raw data that these statistics are based on. And I think that's one of the most interesting things that's been happening. For example, for one story that we did about Me Too, the Me Too movement, we wanted to understand and contextualize the idea of where is sexual harassment the most prominent. And it's one of the hardest things to measure. There are very few studies out there about that, but there is a federal body that collects complaints from across the nation to understand which industry is most afflicted by this, to then help people who have complaints about their bosses get money from them. Compensation. And that government body only publishes summary data of like how many complaints they get per year and how many of those were sexual harassment based, right? By getting that raw data, we were able to query that data for our own purposes to figure out that industries that were most afflicted were things like the restaurant industry or manufacturing industries where the percentage of men is much higher than women workers. Low-paying jobs like farm workers and so on. And that's, again, part number one, government data, get the raw stuff and do your own analysis on it. The second one that I think is interesting is that every office worker on average now produces about 5 gigabytes worth of data every single day. That means that if I go into this computer that maybe an office worker has used and do some digital forensics, I can find enough traces of this person's activities to put together 5 gigabytes worth of data. That was in 2013. Now it's probably more. Which means that we as people produce a lot more data, which is what social media data has become, why social media data has become so interesting. It's used for commercial purposes. All of the information that you give over to Facebook is used as longitudinal data to find out what you like so that I can sell you things. But what I as a journalist want to do is I want to take that data and show you more about yourself. So for Al Jazeera, we retrace the evolution of a political movement through the Facebook messages that these organizers used to put together a protest movement in 86 cities around the world. And now we're seeing an increasing interest in documenting and understanding misconduct online through the data that is out there about trolls, bots. I also love cyborgs and sock puppets. So these are new types of data sets that were produced, again, for commercial purposes that we are now using to do our own investigations. And the third one that I really love is that we can use the tools of developers and technologists to actually do the kind of stories that we want to be doing. One of the best examples for that is like one of the stories that we did recently is we wanted to measure just how much more diverse the Oscars have become. And we were like, how do we do that? Okay, let's look at every single character in the best movie nominated film and look at the percentage of words or lines spoken by them. We turned 22 different scripts into words. We used natural language processing, which is usually used by Google to surface you results, to then look into the number of words, the kinds of words characters of color were speaking, women were speaking, and white characters were speaking, just to get a better understanding of what representation means in a film, right? Because that data doesn't exist. And so in that sense, I think in many ways, we're in this really exciting stage where we all get to nerd out and make our own data based on something that we're curious about. Just because space for data storage has become much cheaper and we can do a lot more and learn a lot more from the tools that are now, that used to be like harbored by commercial companies and entities and are now given on to people like me who sit at home and Google this stuff. Google. Anyhow.
So on the theme of conversations with data, I was thinking about basically how, if we can see it as a conversation, how that works for me. A lot of the time you get a data set and you sure, you might be able to have a conversation in terms of like a source where there's a relationship where you'll ask a question and get an answer. But very often you need to teach it to speak first. So much of the work is about the cleaning, right? So once you kind of develop that relationship, then you're at a point where you can really start to run your queries and kind of frame your story. But on the topic of what if the data doesn't exist at all? What if you can't find your source? What if you've got to rustle it up? What if you've got to kind of compose it from multiple parts? The best example I can think of late that we've done is the Beyond the Blade project. And so what we wanted to do was, at the start of 2017, we wanted to track every death of a child or teenager in the UK. And we wanted to do it because we wanted to have a broader ranging project that was looking at the causes of knife crime and what the impacts were. So initially, the team came together. We were 2 reporters, a projects editor, someone from the community team who would do a lot of outreach work to our readers, and myself, a data reporter. And with that, we kind of had lots of facets of the newsroom, but what we wanted to do initially was, the first question was, well, how big of a problem is it? A lot of people were saying, well, this was an issue back in the 2000s, right? Now it's not such a problem anymore. It's kind of, hasn't knife crime died out? It's not a big thing in British society anymore. And so to answer that, my first question is to go out and find the data source that is going to tell me. And I looked, and I looked, and I searched, and it didn't exist. So there is aggregate level statistics from the Office for National Statistics on the number of stabbings or the number of homicides caused by a knife. But there are no underlying statistics about specific age groups and furthermore ethnicity, which is what we really wanted to look at too, because very often the debate is framed as an issue of gang violence, which has, and when it's reported in the media, has kind of connotations of young black men in urban areas stabbing one another. And so we really wanted to kind of not just deconstruct the figures, but look at the narrative that was going with it. And so we couldn't even answer the most basic questions about knife crime. And if we couldn't do it, it meant also that none of the MPs, none of the politicians or ministers who are creating the laws were doing it either. And so we don't know what we're legislating for. The process that we went through was I sent out an FOI to every police force in the UK, to get the number of stabbings by age and ethnicity. And I also sent an FOI to the Home Office and never expected to hear back from them because they're really bad at getting back to FOI requests. And it was for a data set called the Homicide Index. And with that, I had to go through an appeal process whereby I went to the Information Commissioner, appealed the decision or the rejection from the Home Office for the information, and eventually got the data which showed something completely different to what we had expected, to how the conversation was being framed. That process took 9 months. So we were almost at the end of our project when we could really start to frame what it is that we're talking about. Where should we be going? Who should we be talking about? Who should we be talking to? What age group does this really affect? None of that is in the public domain. So it's very hard to have a conversation if you can't even get the basics. So that is a big part of the process of the job, is pulling the information together. Sometimes the source doesn't exist, and you've got to rustle it up.
There's so many issues here. I kind of feel like there's, and you started off talking about data as an issue. So there's a few things here. So the idea of where data stories come from, I think, the analogy of having a drunk friend next to you shouting at you, which is kind of what looking at a raw data set is like. So I teach data journalism, and people come into the class thinking they're going to be poring over spreadsheets, which is literally the most pointless activity 9 times out of 10. I think a lot of good stories come out of a journalist thinking, I want to know this. How can I find out this? Maybe I can get it from this data, and that process kind of leading you through. And obviously inherent in that are the biases that we all have and the attitudes that we all come to those stories with. But I still haven't found a better way for finding a story. And I think the other thing about, which I've really noticed from teaching, is that the skills that really need kind of encouraging in people are often the storytelling skills. You can learn a technique, right? You can learn how to go through a data set. You can learn, the latest visualization technique. But learning how to treat data journalistically, skeptically, to examine it properly is a real skill that needs to be taught and that everybody needs to practice. And that leads me to the idea of kind of data as an issue. So, the Mark Twain quote that a lie can be halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. Now, you know, the way that we live today exacerbates that process, right? The lie can be there way before you've woken up, and the idea was always that we would be able to spread the truth through data. We would say, well, actually, you're saying this, but this is the truth. Look at the data, and it says that. And I think a few years ago that kind of worked, and now what I'm starting to see, I have this feeling that actually there are some people who will never believe that truth that you're telling, and partly that's because of who are we talking to? Who are we talking to when we produce a piece of data journalism? Are we talking to people like ourselves? Are we talking to, thinking about, our colleagues or people who are going to be impressed by what we've done because it's kind of smart and clever? Are we thinking about, our next employer? Are we thinking about, like, trying to explain stuff to people that we know in ways that everybody can understand? So, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff there, but it feels to me like, the root of it is the idea of who are we trying to actually work for? Are we working, like I say, for ourselves or for the world?
That's a perfect segue onto what I was going to ask. Uncannily perfect for what I was going to ask next, which was, in a sense, many of the sort of conventions that we're very familiar with in terms of working with data can be traced back to, the history of statistics, different sorts of scientific practices, but also graphical practices for making things visible through line graphs and charts, which have become very established. And many of those do different things. Like I really like what Lam was saying about how there's this kind of shift towards recognizing different sorts of issues as an institutional level, whether it's who's here, like who the sort of demographic categories which are used to consider what sorts of people live in a place, and how you can then measure sort of different aspects of how you're dealing with and responding to people. But I guess one of the things I'm very curious about is more recently you see this shift away from these very specific forms of objectivity and demonstration and proof, which were associated with the kind of use of data in legal context, in science, in administrative contexts, to different sorts of experience, different sorts of feelings. You even see, short data projects like, the Fallen.io, where it's really kind of, there's an emotional character to data. And I guess I was curious, exactly riffing off of Simon's last point, whether you could say a little bit more about who these experiences are for and how they might also produce different sorts of interactivity and engagement with your topics, or whether, in the case of some of the projects that Simon's worked on in the past, people might contribute to the data set or make sense of the data in other ways. But I was curious if you could say a little bit more about what the different things that you've done have produced in terms of engagement or reactions from public institutions or whatever it is.
I think I guess it was one of the most fun projects that I have worked on at the times. It was an astonishing data set it was the tax records of everyone in the United States, which is a data set that you cannot have access to unless you're in part of a small group of researchers, I think from one of the big Ivy League universities. So the researchers contacted us and said, we have this data set and we want to do something with it, with you. And one of the things we were looking into were the relationship between because in tax records you have all the income of all the people in the States, and combined with other data, you can find out how much money people make, and then you can look at 30 years later, so this was a long time series, over 30 years, and you could look what is the likelihood that, or not even the likelihood, what's the actual percentage of kids from these parents who went to college after this. So you could get a direct relationship between the income of the parents to the percent of people of kids who got to college. And when we get the data and we visualize it, what we ended up with was a straight line. Like that's when you have like a scatter plot and you put one variable on one side and one on the y-axis, and then you see the correlation. And the perfect correlation is a straight line. And that's what this looks like this perfect correlation between income and the chance to go to college. And then we thought about how can we turn this boring straight line into a conversation. How can we make this interesting? And what we ended up doing is to not plot the data, but to ask the readers. We gave them an empty plot. Probably, maybe you've seen this. We gave them an empty chart and gave them one point and said, what do you think is the correlation between these two variables? And then after we done this, we've shown them the actual line, and then we went to all the submissions. And that's actually interesting because we created a new data set that is about the assumption and the hypothesis that the people had. And there was like a lot of these S-curves that saw that in the lower income it doesn't matter, but then there's obviously it's going up, but then in the high income range it's going flat again. But that's like actually a direct correlation. So I think that's an interesting example of not just as a journalist having a conversation with the data, but trying to pull the reader in and the users in to think about the data before they even see it. Yeah.
That's great.
In terms of engagement with sort of public bodies and public institutions, I guess that's something that as a campaign organisation we do quite a lot of, and we push very hard on governments to publish more information, for instance, on who the real owners of companies are, because in our experience of investigating corruption in the oil, gas and mining industries, we've always found that kind of corporate secrecy and shell companies are the vehicles through which the corrupt kind of get away with their ill-gotten loot. And a couple of years ago, the UK government published the world's first kind of open register of who controls companies, which now is rather large. It has, lists about sort of over 4 million so-called beneficial owners. But, as to be expected, we were inevitably disappointed when we first looked at this data set, because we were hoping it was going to enable us to kind of further investigate many of the dead ends that we'd found with UK-based shell companies, but we actually realised that a good portion of this data was incredibly poor. So we've actually spent a lot of our time, the object of our study being the data set itself, and highlighting issues with the data, such as the fact that kind of about 400 companies are controlled by toddlers in the UK, or a whole bunch of companies are controlled by people who have no longer been born. And actually putting those observations back to the publishing agency, who then refine their user interface for inputting the data, hopefully will contribute to making that data more useful and actually have the possibility for kind of red flagging suspicious activity in the future.
I think if I'm understanding this rightly, you're trying to figure out who I'm doing data journalism for.
Amongst other things. So in a sense, on the one hand, the sort of the context of producing data and producing graphics about data could be seen in the context of like science and statistics, whereas I think recently there's more experimentation with visual formats, which also creates different forms of engagement.
Okay.
And that can be with different sorts of data publics, or with institutions, or with NGOs. In a sense, I guess part of the implicit question was what you were alluding to earlier, I think, when you were saying, who picks what gets counted through data, and how does data journalism sort of potentially sit between sort of data producers and people who are interested in looking at sort of data stories?
Right. I think one of the things, there was actually a student I met in Kenya who may be here, but she was asking me before this panel a question of like, how do you think you can get data to be interesting to other people, to everyone? And I think for me, one of my biggest directives is always like, the same way I design, the same way I tell a story, it's actually all for my mom. This sounds really dumb, but I think the biggest thing that you talked about that I really hate about some parts of our industry is that a lot of graphics reporters and a lot of data journalism the discussion seems to never leave the circle of the data journalists, right? And for me, my biggest objective was like, the reason why I'm in journalism has nothing to do with like, being a journalist with a capital J. It has all to do with my parents. My mom came over to Germany as a refugee. My father and my parents, my mom were separated for 9 years due to the Vietnam War, and in large part, that was one of the most misconstrued like media wars and how it was like portrayed. And for me, then it's become my imperative in journalism is to give people a nuanced understanding of a bigger context, a nuanced understanding of an issue. And that means understanding finding a way of not just selling data, but like also figuring out a way of finding the human in that story, in that data story. So engagement for me always is micro and macro. That can mean that I'm going to graph out what it feels like to be trolled by one person. I do a lot of what I call quantified selfies, where I look into an emblematic story of a person through their data and what that means in a larger scheme, right? What does it mean to be attacked by alt-right trolls because you are an Asian woman and you look like another Asian woman who was in like in Rex Tillerson's hearing and like thereby maybe a spy for the left, right? And so when it comes to engagement, for me, a measure of success is not the traffic, but it's more qualitative than that. It's understanding like whether people change their behaviors, whether people change their view on something, and that can be measured in smaller anecdotes, but also in ways of understanding how people talk about your work. I don't care if journalists talk about my work. I care about how people, even if they're angry, the ways in which people talk about the content of something is more important to me than the actual like debate about the higher level subject. Does that help? Is that coming close to what you think? Yeah.
I guess building on what you've just talked about, and you mentioned earlier on as well with regards the idea of what's measured and what's not. The Beyond the Blade project kind of really went to the heart of that as well. I mean, for us, it was an interesting project because it's really picking apart statistics that are out there on a high level, but it's the smaller level detail that's informative, right? It's the smaller level detail that will allow us as journalists to relate that back to people's lives, and that is primarily my job. I run my team to talk to our readers. So I run my team with the idea that we're doing journalism to connect with people's lives and to make them engage with a particular issue. And sometimes I feel that stories that very much focus on numbers and just kind of, as you say, don't leave that circle of kind of conversation between people like us, right? People, you know, we find something cool and it's interesting, but the real challenge is to make that connect, to actually have an impact and to have some resonance with our readers and people we wouldn't normally reach. And sometimes data can help you do that, but then I also believe that people choose their narratives. People choose the narratives of their lives and how they perceive the world, and some of them will reach, some of them will never reach. I mean, the Beyond the Blade project, for me, was really, really interesting when we had finished the project, and this was maybe about 3 weeks ago, when we got a call from the Solicitor General's office in the Parliament who wanted to see us about the project. And we went to see Robert Buckland and had a conversation with him, and he really wanted to know, what did we know? And we were baffled. It was fascinating. It was really, really odd, because my response was, you have all of this information at your fingertips. You can call up the Home Office and get everything out of the homicide index. You can do the analysis that we've done in a much more simple, straightforward way. But it's having that idea that there is something in that data set that relates to people's lives, right? And how can we make that relevant? How can we have insights? You know, for his view, it was towards creating policy. For our view, it's towards informing the debate and having a broader conversation about knife crime in the UK. So, yeah.
That's so interesting. I think we're kind of a slightly roundabout way, I promise, not too long. So one of the things I've been doing is I've done these books for children, which are kind of infographics books for children. And when I did them, it was just a job. You know, I thought it would be kind of, you know, a nice side thing. But my kids really like them because they finally understand. Firstly, they finally understand what I do for a living, which is useful. But secondly, it's because the world is this kind of really nuanced grey place that's hard for people to understand, and facts and data can give us a bit of a kind of routing, right? We know, you know, how far a crocodile can run and that sort of thing. It's kind of cool, right? But I think that a lot of the data that we deal with, official data, is you know, it's kind of given a reverence it doesn't really deserve. You know, official data is really kind of the least worst guess. Okay, we don't really know what GDP is. We don't really know kind of how many people are actually unemployed. We don't know any of this stuff. But some of the data sets, like some of the stuff that you guys collect, we do know because you've collected that data. You know it, and you can trust it. I think there's a personal humanity to that data that you collect because you know it's true and it's about real people that can connect with people out there in the world. And I think the best data journalism that makes me really happy is when I see something really complicated turn into something you can understand because you can see how it affects you, like personally. And I think that's where, again, it comes back to that thing of who we're working for and doing stuff that can connect with your mom, with your father, with your kids is what it's about. And when I was at journalism school, I was told you're writing for an intelligent 12-year-old. And I try and keep that in mind all the time as well.
I wanted to also follow on with, I guess, there's a kind of a dilemma which kind of arises from some of the things you were talking about earlier in terms of who gets to shape what data is created and what that enables us to know, the sorts of conversations it enables us to have, the sorts of questions that we can address. And the dilemma is essentially that, that some of the different sorts of data sets we've been talking about, whether it's census data or large-scale statistical data or company registers data or social media data, depend on kind of having many resources, lots of people, sort of huge technological infrastructures in order to create these things. And I really like the idea that data journalism can be a space in which to experiment with different ways in which things can be measured, right? Yet at the same time, you're faced, many of you I'm sure, on a daily basis with the constraints of your organizations. So I guess the first thing is, how do you deal with that? And the second thing is, what do you think the prospects are for more collaborative approaches to the development of data sets or data infrastructures in response to the fact that, there's only so much you can do as an individual or within a small team?
So from my experience, in terms of the constraints, I think what I found very important is to push for more time. That's what I was trying to do all the time. Sometimes it works that you anticipate something is going to be important, and then you have time to prepare yourself. But more often than not, it is not. You do your data search. You call people, ask them what could I use, and then you end up in a dead end. And that's the sad part, that often then the time constraint leaves you at this dead end, and you decide to spike it. That's always the first question that arises in this conversation is, do we have data? Is the data suitable for a story? Can we do that? And I was sometimes disappointed that I've had the feeling that there could be something that would have required maybe a week or two more work, and then sometimes that was not possible. And I think that's a big opportunity that we're missing, and that I always dislike that there's this. In some newsrooms, there's this investigative unit, and they get to work like a year on their story, and then other desks have to turn out the stories all the time. I think we have to pull more of these investigative thinking into all the desks across the newsroom. Sometimes, you have to go through 60 pages of PDF, and you have to bring them into a spreadsheet format, and that just takes like a week of work or 3 days if you get another another friend to help you going through this, because it's just like stupid work of going page to page and cleaning the data to getting it into a spreadsheet. So, yeah. So my answer is advocating for more and talking to editors.
So yeah, at Global Witness, we have a staff body of about 100 people, many of whom work with data. It's key to lots of our work, and it always has been. But we are constrained when it comes to technical capacity for kind of doing any form of statistical analysis or particularly working with larger data sets. I guess we're working out with how to deal with that constraint, and I mean the approach currently being taken is that it doesn't scale just to kind of add more and more sort of so-called data specialists. We really just have to embed it as strongly as possible, you know, the skills and tools that are required. So at the moment we're kind of rolling out an internal sort of data journalism curriculum, getting people familiar with the techniques and some of the, you know, great tools that are available there, like, you know, Gregor's Datawrapper, or Document Cloud for being able to store large versions of documents. And then sometimes it's also about making that upfront investment when you know you're starting on maybe a medium or long-term project, making sure that you've got the data in a form in which less technical journalists are able to interrogate and have those conversations with. So recently you've been spending a lot more time kind of developing and modeling and building good quality databases that allow for visual exploration. So I think, you know, and particularly when you have company registry data, which we work with a lot, kind of getting that into a network database that people can then sort of point and click and exploit the advantages of interactivity, so to zone in on kind of interesting features. That's been helpful to date, but it is something we're working out.
When it comes to resources, I think that's one of the things that I've seen over and over again teaching around the world. I've taught data journalism in Myanmar, I've taught it, some of it in Kenya, in Alaska, in small newsrooms, local newsrooms. I care a lot about those newsrooms because they want to be doing these things and they want to learn those things. And a few things that can help them. Number one, tools are readily accessible. Every professor I know who does this kind of work puts their stuff up for free. I'm putting my stuff up for free. If you need any tools, I come with a lifetime guarantee. This is what I tell all my students. If you need me, just get in touch. I will refer you to the Python book I'm writing, my data journalism stuff I'm writing, putting out there. Just come. Number two, I think you can definitely lean on other people to collaborate with you. What the Panama Papers have shown on a larger scale, but what I've also seen on a smaller scale between people who find each other in a Slack channel is that you can collaborate. Now, I think people have come to realize that competition is kind of foolish when it comes to doing this kind of work because it takes a lot of expertise and it takes a lot of resources. So work with others. There are enough people who are collaborating, for example, on the ProPublica documenting hate project. That is a project where people are trying to put together documentation and data around hate crimes that are being committed in the US post-Trump election, right? And understanding that it's not too much to ask is one of the first steps for people to take to bring this together. And yeah, I think one of the things that I also find interesting when it comes to investigations is that a legacy, I think, myth from the olden times is that everything needs to be 12,000 words and large and make a huge impact. I actually don't think that attention works like that anymore. I actually think that one of the things that I love about Buzzfeed and have learned from Buzzfeed is how to get information to people in an incremental way and to do what I call bite-sized investigations. A little bit of data here, a little bit of information about the subject there. You do not need to harbor everything until December of the year so that you can put together a giant opus that maybe 20 people will read, 2 of which might be like lawmakers. But if you want to have impact, you can do that on a smaller scale too. So if you bite off less with each story, you can do a lot more when it comes to when it comes to raising awareness and bringing information to an audience that needs that information. And yeah, I think that is a way to work around and also to adapt to the times and to the ways in which people consume information.
So, on the topic of it being a bit of a dilemma, I guess, in terms of the information we have and the difficulties that we can face in terms of trying to pull something together to make a story out of it. In our newsroom, we also teach our reporters how to work with data. And what I'm always at pains to get across is that it is not rocket science, right? A lot of us here probably code or have built up our skills over years, over decades. But the reality is that there are stories that you can do on a beat if you don't have a wealth of data journalism skills in terms of things like Excel or programming. You don't have to have that to be able to do data journalism. So very often when I'm talking with people, I'm trying to get them to think about the kind of cache of paper documents you have, there's information in that. If there's information that's structured in terms of dates or names or addresses, we can create a data set with that. We can convert it into a data set. So it's about taking the small steps. It's about even kind of getting that document, like a document state of mind where you're thinking about what documentation do I have that I can create a data set with, and also looking for documents in kind of hidden places as well, like you talked about. I think that that's really liberating because it gives you a sense that as a reporter, you don't need to be able to program. That it's really about having a structured mindset to begin with. And structure is really kind of where it all builds from. In terms of training one another and kind of keeping the door open, I think that's massively useful as well. Because in our newsroom, the reason to train the reporters is to kind of raise the general skill level and raise the kind of literacy around data and what it is you can do with it. And as we do that, then our other reporters who, some reporters can do basic data analysis, and then the rest of us can move on to do bigger things because there's more and more information all the time, and it's just a matter of having enough hours in the day, right, to do the stories you want to do. In terms of collaboration, I think, there's so much information out there. A lot of it isn't the kind of stories that we want to do. A lot of the information that we want to do it on is not structured. And so I think there are ways that we can look to collaborating with groups like academics. Very often, we collaborate or we have conversations as well with NGOs, like Global Witness or others. And it's about kind of understanding, informing one another's conversations around what data exists and what we can do with it. I think that's massively useful. So it's an area that we should probably explore more as reporters as well.
So I think, the playing field that we're on has never been as level as it is now, and it's only getting that way. So if you look at the entries to the Data Journalism Awards, for instance, the numbers of entries that are from all over the world, from all kinds of countries, big and small. Obviously, there are a lot from the US and the UK and Germany and so on, but this year we've got people in the shortlist from Malaysia and the Philippines and Pakistan and Nigeria, and it's amazing to me. And I think that's partly because of the way the tools have changed, that we've all got access, and the idea that it's super expensive to do data journalism was always a bit of a cop-out by people who didn't really want to do it. So I think there's a bit of that. I work a lot now with search data, which is incredibly interesting. It's huge. It tells you a lot about who we are as people, but it's incredibly fluid. It changes. If you're looking at the top search thing, 1 minute it could be Donald Trump, the next minute it'll be Khloe Kardashian, then it'll be football results, and it'll be how to make a souffle. These things kind of oscillate a lot. And the way they work best is often when they're combined with something else. That skill of mashing up different data sets. So I'm glad you mentioned documenting hate. We're involved in that project. And for that project, what we did was we used Google News data, which is around the corpus of news stories that feed Google News. And we wanted to get every little story around hate crime. We wanted to go from tiny news outlets in the Midwest to, right up to New York Times. We wanted those small stories because we wanted to pick up on local stories that were happening that weren't getting reported elsewhere. And then we used the natural language processing of the Google Cloud's API to process all those articles and read through them and kind of produce categorizations about these articles. What kinds of offences are they about? Who are they about? Where are they about? And kind of bringing that together. And it's a similar kind of thing to Electionland, really. Electionland is this amazing collaboration of different types of data sets, from people's reports on the ground to Google search trends to news data, all this stuff kind of brought together. And then at the end of it still requires a human at the end of it, though, to go out there and verify and check some of the stories. And to me, that's like the perfect scenario, because you've got the best of human reporting and the best of machine reporting, kind of bringing them together.
Thank you. I think I'm going to ask, I don't know if this is abusing my role as chair, I'm going to ask one more question and then see if we can go to the floor. Which is, I guess, just to kind of start to draw things towards a close. I think several of you have mentioned in different contexts that data is becoming kind of like really integrated in just the practice of journalism, right? So data journalism, in a sense, just becomes, in the same way that photojournalism the use of photography in journalism was very wild in the beginning. They're like, wow, we can like show war scenes, so we don't have to have painters going out. But there was this kind of real kind of excitement about this particular way of seeing the world through photography. And then, you know, we have all these other films like other forms like documentary film, these ways of seeing the world. And I guess I'm kind of curious about your own feelings about now, after this field has, you know, still emerging, but it's kind of grown a bit more than it was a few years ago. What excites or concerns you about this particular way of seeing or experiencing and narrating the world through data at the moment? That's a big question. Do you know what I mean? Like, I guess just to give an example, one of the things that people promised very early on, or were very excited about, was the idea that you can move away from sort of the news values of recency, things being kind of breaking news and sort of rolling stories, and a human interest, and you can start to look at kind of structural problems or systemic problems at scale, right? That's something one could debate.
I think one thing that excites me a lot is that a data set can help put a local story into a bigger context, or can break down a national data set into local stories, and the way that this is now feeding back into the reporting. Instead of just randomly picking where you start a reporting trip, you use it. I think no reporter would do that anymore. They instead look at data and see where are places where a certain problem like drug overdoses are the most pressing, and then you start from there. And so your travel trip, instead of being this by accident thing, you start using data to and I think that's very, very exciting, and I love that in this way data kind of leaves this nerd corner of the newsroom and becomes more and more being used everywhere in the newsroom.
I suppose from my perspective as a campaigner, what data gives, and it's a double-edged sword, I suppose, is that it's surprising by the way in which just quantifying something or putting a number to something can make policymakers' ears prick up and make at least, you know, certain policy points travel much further in a political environment. You know, just being able to quantify the number of, you know, we did an investigation into the number of properties owned by shell companies in the UK, particularly in London, and just being able to kind of say that it was 86,000, you know, got us into rooms that we weren't able previously to speak in when it came to policymakers, and that often surprises me, because in a sense that's about the uncritical sort of consumption of numbers and the aura of kind of importance and objectivity they have, but it is still kind of a relatively effective ploy when it comes to policy. Whether or not that's effective in kind of engaging a broader public is another question, but something certainly very useful in the context of my work.
Yeah, I think what you guys are touching upon is that there's a raised level of data literacy, which I really am excited about. I mean, like, one of the biggest stories right now about Facebook is people getting upset about their metadata. Have you ever thought that like thousands, millions of people would get angry at Mark Zuckerberg about their location data and their like the little pieces when they liked something and all of this data that is collected around them, not even the actions themselves. Like, that actually to me is like a wonderful, as a data nerd, it's a wonderful entry for me to finally talk about all the things to the people that I've really cared about for a long time. And I think that in itself bodes well for an increased importance of data and understanding the larger context of it. It also clamps down on false narratives. I think especially, I used to be based in Hong Kong, and for a long time there were these like very post-colonial, like romanticized ways of looking at a place, but when you have data disproving that or proving that, that's a wonderful way of fact-checking bad narratives that you were also talking about. And then what I do think is important nowadays, with people glomming onto data more is that there are more data lies out there. There's this thing that I see oftentimes where editors come and they want data magic sprinkled on their stories, and they're like, make it work with the numbers. And I get very, I get very wary of very strong statements based on one data point, or statements based on data that are very binary. Like data is always complicated, dirty, messy, nasty, and never really tells you exactly what you wanted to say. And if you're not reading a story that has a clear explanation of what the data measures, a clear explanation of the caveats of the data, you're probably being a little bit lied to. And that is a very important point to make when it comes to data journalism. Just because it's popular and people are becoming more aware of it doesn't mean that people aren't using it to lie. And I think that's a big thing that I want people to understand.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And in a sense, I mean, broader use doesn't necessarily mean that those problems end, right? It can just actually mean a proliferation of problems. Yeah, I mean, I suppose here at Perugia about 6 years ago, we were having a conversation around, can data journalism save your newsroom? I remember that was like the topic of one of the, I know, right? We're laughing now. But it has been really exciting. There's been loads of developments, and I feel like it has become more integrated in newsrooms, but I still think there is an awful long way to go. But the things that kind of excited me then still excite me now, because I think they're still true. So it can help you talk to bigger systemic problems. You can use a data set to kind of paint a picture about what this data tells you about a particular societal issue. Might be knife crime or the gender pay gap, which we've just done a lot of reporting on in the UK as well. But then it also allows you to find the interesting kind of case studies, right? It allows you to find the interesting human elements of the story. And that has always been my concern, to make sure that it connects. So I still worry that sometimes maybe we lose sight of that and get excited about something that looks great or sounds great, but it's just that the harder job is then making that connect to people's lives. And that's always the thing I want to do, right? I don't want people to switch off when they read a story with like 20 numbers in the first 3 paragraphs. I want them to read something that excites them. And I think the kind of things that worry me are the same things that Lam just talked about. So the misuse of data, that is the same old, right? That's not going away anytime soon.
So I know it's late and I risk losing you, but I'm going to start a little bit of history. First issue of The Guardian, 1821, comes with a table of data on the first news page. It takes up a third of the page. It's a list of schools in Manchester, how much money spent to them, how many students they have. It was 60 years before education was compulsory, incredibly political data, and it was leaked to the paper. It wasn't, given by anybody, because this wasn't data that people like to release. And the person that leaked it said, words to the effect of, data is important because without it we don't understand what's going on. Unless we understand what's going on, we can't change society for the better. Now, I still believe that's true today. I still believe that the best answer to a lie is the truth. But as Jay Rosen said, you can't bring a fact check to a culture war. So I think it's the way that we present that data that becomes the big issue. The way that data's surfaced on search. Google has a responsibility to help surface good data journalism and useful data. And as journalists, we also have a responsibility to tell those stories, make those facts apparent in ways that people understand and they can relate to.
Yes, I've got one here.
Yeah, we have the microphone.
Hi. I'm not a traditional journalist, but I had a question regarding data journalism. How are the reproducible practices being implemented in individual analysis, and how are these practices encouraged by your organizations or teams that you're working in?
I'm sure a few people will have things to say about this. In terms of reproducibility, something we're thinking a lot about, and I know a few of us on this panel were recently at kind of a big conference of computer-assisted reporting or sort of data journalism, and that seemed to be one of the emergent kind of hot topics in the area. And I think, at least in my organisation, what we're increasingly trying to do is where we do an analysis, that we publish the underlying script. So usually in the form of an R Markdown or Jupyter notebooks, to make sure that that can be downloaded, and if it's using public data, the analysis reproduced. Obviously, some of the issues can be around kind of confidentiality and data protection and source protection, of course, but where possible, I think our attitude is very much, given that we put so much pressure on governments and companies to be transparent, that we need to be very clear, and I'm hoping that in future that'll open up a dialogue for for people to build on each other's methods, and I think we're already seeing that a bit with some of the other organisations who are doing similar kind of reproducible publication.
I would say that the kind of key ways that we try to make our work as transparent as possible is by linking out to methodologies. Very often it's a struggle to try and get the newsroom to print a methodology about how something's been done, but sometimes the process is actually as interesting, well, to me, as the story. So we do very often write up methodologies where something has been like a long kind of process, where we may not be able to publish or link out to the data because it might not be in the public domain. It might be something that we've worked on and therefore we don't necessarily publish. We also link out to anything in the public domain, and then very often we'll put our scripts on GitHub as well for projects that we've worked on.
Yeah, I think it's, sorry. I think it's really, just really quickly, I think it's really encouraging that most of the people, everybody on this table has published their data, right? Published their workings. That is the best thing about data to me, that openness and transparency.
Yeah, we follow the same principle. If you go to github.com/BuzzFeed News, you will find published data sets, Jupyter notebooks, where you only have to click, run the script, and you can, that should allow you to replicate an analysis. And the person you should follow, and if you have any questions about that, who is wonderful and who's been putting a lot of this information out there, is Jeremy Singer-Vine. He's our data editor, and he's just been fabulous about being helpful, running workshops, and speaking about reproducibility. Yeah.
Yes, I think we're going to have this kind of lottery. So whoever puts their hand up first gets to ask the final question. Everyone has a final question. If no questions are forthcoming, then I will ask. Okay,
I work in the Middle East, which is not a place where it's very easy to have access to information. So I was wondering if you have any tips as to other tools that can be used when you can't expect government or companies to give data to you.
I would say it's about using the information that you have to try and create your own data sets. With the knife crime project, for that first year, we didn't have any data because it wasn't centrally collated by anybody. So there was no one authority who was going to tell us how many people had been stabbed that year. So I sat down with the two reporters and said, let's have a think about it. What story do we want to tell? What are the top lines that we want out of it? And those are basically what form the basis of the spreadsheet, right? So the column headers or the variables. So we wanted to know what age they were, what ethnicity they were, what time of day it was it outside a school, was it in a park, what day of the week it was. And all of that allows us to talk about who it's happening to, where it's happening, and kind of paint a picture of what the typical scene might look like. And that's not structured information. It wasn't even in paper documents. It was more just news reports. So that's probably my best tip for when something doesn't exist, thinking about what's the most basic approach that I can have to creating some structure with which I can feed information and get a top line. Think of the top lines as you're creating that structure itself.
Two examples. I think you should definitely work with human rights organizations or NGOs. They often do a lot of data collection and surveys. There's a great organization based in Switzerland that I can probably tweet at you if you tweet at me at some point, that's been tracking deaths in Syria, for example, and they do survey-based data collection. Oftentimes academics and NGOs will have that data. They will only publish the summary table. go back to them and ask them to run another analysis based on your questions of their data. They're often very happy to see their work being cited. Number two, structure. Information to a data sleuth is just waiting to be structured. So if you look at websites or Facebook groups, I think Facebook has become an interesting place to look at wrongdoings and misconduct to trace back to, and that you can figure out through APIs, but also looking at manually collecting data. For example, there's an NGO in Myanmar that looked into hate speech on Facebook by manually collecting hundreds of posts and analyzing each one of them. That might take longer, but because you are probably the only one doing it, you will probably also be the only one publishing it, right? And last but not least, there is a way of doing, like, there are tools. I taught a lot of Google Sheets, where if you want to start doing it, you need big number of people helping you, but like, let's say you start with a neighborhood and you start collecting data around that and putting that in a Google Sheet. One of my favorite reporters out there, and she's also a dear friend, Azmat Khan, you should read her story called The Uncounted, where she went to, I think, more than 150 drone strike zones, physically, to look into the number of civilian deaths that the US reported and that she actually found on the ground. That took a year and a half, but she did a similar story in Afghanistan about ghost schools, where she went to every 50 schools that she found to figure out whether people were still there. It is a lot more work. I think the Afghanistan story took 7 months, the Iraq story took a year and a half, but she was able to come to the table with hugely important data that she herself collected by going there one by one. It sucks, and I know that there's a lot more like dangers involved in doing that kind of work abroad, but you can find a way of doing it. It just takes a little longer, yeah.
Just to reiterate on you guys say, I mean, that manual collection is incredibly powerful and produces amazing stories. Some of these sites are fantastic. I hate to say it because I work there, but trends.google.com has data for almost every country in the world. And you can find out what people, you want to find out how people are feeling about things, what people are searching for. It's there now, and you can just use that.
Okay, I think we're at time. Thank you so much for coming and joining us, and I would like you to join me in thanking the speakers. And just so that you know, all of them will be contributing to the Data Journalism Handbook, which will be freely available online, where the conversation will continue, datajournalismhandbook.org. Friday evening, the sun has come out. Thank you very much for joining us. Yes.